How's it going? So let's take a look at some writers of prose here. First one is Washington Irving. Some of you may not recognize the name, but definitely going to recognize some of his stories. He was very important, involved in creating an autonomous American style about people, places, and things that are purely American. And he was the first one to set this mold. So we're going in this order here, trying to create, what are the things that created an American identity? We're going to take a look first at this with him. So here's a picture of him, jovial fellow, and very diverse career, wrote about a lot of things, and we're going to take a look at some of them here. So he wrote on a range of subjects and topography. Three major topics he wrote about were New York State, Christopher Columbus, and the West of America. And this covers a lot of different territory. Why would he write about Christopher Columbus? Perhaps some interest in the founding of the Americas. So he's best known for his stories Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow that appear in the sketchbook of Geoffrey Graham. Now, when I was young, I used to, I went to camp up in the mountains, and the counselors would always talk about The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, and I was young, I was scared, and they were very, very spooky elements. But it's these are stories that are brought about to the youth and very enticing. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow with a headless horseman, as you can see here in this picture. It's kind of curious because, like in the case of Rip Van Winkle, the story is interesting because it takes place in the Catskill Mountains. So when I was younger, I used to, think about that. And then I ended up going to college right next to the Catskill Mountains. So I used to always look across the water and think about, these stories. And the sun set right on that too. So it was a very romantic experience for me. So if we think about these things a little bit, the stories are, they have a lot of, especially The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It's got a lot of action in it, and it's got a lot of, a lot of tension, and it's a great narrative. But if we go back and we think about, for example, Rip Van Winkle. Let's take a look at Rip Van Winkle here. If we think about him, his story is interesting because it's about a guy, he lives up in the mountains, and he's kind of lazy, and he likes to run errands for some of the local women. Basically, he's up in the woods one day and falls asleep after giving some drink from these men up in the mountains. He falls asleep and wakes up 20 years later. And when he wakes up, he's goes back to where he was in the mountains, and goes back and he finds his daughter with child and his son, and he's like, what's going on? He finds out his son's just like him, and he kind of picks up where he left off there. But the whole point is that America is waking up after so many years of living in a certain way. And when you wake up, he wakes up, he sleeps through the Revolutionary War and through the founding of the new government. But it's basically Americans are now waking up from this previous experience and discovering this new life. So in addition to this book, he wrote some satirical work at the beginning of his career. He wrote in the literary magazine Salmagundi with his brother and a colleague. This was at the beginning of the 19th century. It was a satirical viewpoint about life and politics of New York. So here he's writing more about New York. The Catskill Mountains are in New York, and here he's writing about New York City. But it's kind of curious because it was here that he gave New York City the name Gotham, if that sounds familiar. Gotham City. What superhero is that about? He also wrote a history of New York from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty by Diedrich Knickerbocker in 1809. It's his first major book, which was another satirical work about New York. So This is interesting. He actually wrote it, but put up this fictitious name, Knickerbocker, which helped him earn notoriety. If I remember correctly, he put out a missing persons report for this fellow Knickerbocker, and the whole city was up and, curious about who is this fellow, where can we find him? And then it was eventually discovered that, it was Irving that wrote this. So, that this helped him gain notoriety for this particular work. And today, the word Knickerbocker is sometimes used for New Yorker, New Yorkian. So Irving is also known for his work on Spain. He wrote a biography on Christopher Columbus and other works about Granada and the Alhambra. The Alhambra is in Andalusia in the south of Spain. It's a beautiful, huge architectural structure from the era of the Moors. He was appointed the minister of Spain and spent many years there during the tumultuous 19th century on the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is another word for the peninsula on which Spain and Portugal are found. This left him disheartened and wishing to return home. So Spain at this time is going through a lot of political upheaval, which was in stark contrast with the developments in the United States. Things had developed, and the country was founded, and it was concrete. And from this point forward, the Americans now were going to forge an identity. But in Spain, all the tumultuous coming back and forth with the different dynasties and the monarchies was very confusing for him. So he came back to the United States. He was a little bit disheartened when he came back. So in addition to the biography on Columbus, he also wrote about George Washington, Muhammad, and Oliver Goldsmith. So he's written a lot of biographies. And you can see here that in the 1830s, he also wrote about the American West, such as the adventures of Captain Bonneville and A Tour on the Prairies. Some believe that he wrote this in response to those who criticized his European trips and interests. If he writes about New York and then he leaves and then comes back, he's saying, "Oh, you went away and you're not really founded in what's happening here." So then he wrote about the West, which is excellent because, he wrote about the West and he wrote about New York State, and he wrote about a lot of things, a lot of different biographies here. Muhammad, that's an extension. Christopher Columbus, he did a lot of research when he was over in Spain too about that. He was very curious about the starting of the Americas. So very scholar, diverse writer, definitely important in the founding of what is unique American literature. So we've got James Fenimore Cooper. So he wrote a lot about the West and about the Navy. I was in the Navy. His first work was The Spy, about counter-espionage during the Revolutionary War. Now, you can see the date here, 1820, and that's important because, we're kind of looking back now, and, this whole idea of nostalgia, looking back on, the beginnings again. Remember, we looked at this before, the way some of the Puritans were looking back on, just 80 years afterwards, looking back nostalgically about the beginning of their arrival of to the New World. And here we've got kind of, the same thing. It's got some ideas here about espionage during the Revolutionary War. But this is also important because it's kind of a rewriting of history. And here's a picture of him. You can see here a fellow. I think it's another, looks like a painting in black and white, a painting that's made after in black and white. Maybe it's a photograph, I don't know. But this was around the time when photography was, mid-19th century, when it started with the daguerreotypes and the first photography. So he's most famous for his books, The Deerslayer and The Last of the Mohicans. You may be familiar with this because they were made into movies in the 20th century. The Deerslayer a number of times. The Last of the Mohicans was a major production, and I remember watching that when I was younger. But these two books appear in the Leatherstockings series, and they're a series of 5 historical novels about the difficulties Native Americans faced with the New World, with the new country here. And the interactions are very, it's kind of imposing a lot of the ideas onto the Native Americans, adapting some of the struggles, some of the interactions and the developments that we can see as the nation is progressing. And here's one of the paintings or from the covers of that. You can see here, it's kind of got that idea once again that we've seen this a number of times before about, Indian or Native American taking away somebody in captivity. Anyways. So let's take a look here at George Washington Harris. He's another writer, antebellum. Antebellum is a pre-Civil War humorist. He wrote about the life in the South. So, like I said before, it's kind of important to look at different geographical regions and these different writers and the different areas that they represent. We've covered New York, we've covered the Catskill Mountains in New York, the city area, and we've covered the West, and now we're going down to the South. So his most famous character is Sullivan Good. He's a poorly educated Appalachian fellow who took joy in lies and tricking others. But this is interesting because it was written in the characteristics of an exaggerated Southern dialect. I suggest that you Google this, take a look at some of the different types of the writing styles that this author has, especially this one in general, because it's interesting to see how this style of writing and writing in dialect developed in literature, and how people used, they purposefully wrote specific ways to imitate the way people spoke. So he was influential for other writers of the South, such as Mark Twain and William Faulkner. We'll take a look at these writers later on, but it's very interesting to see how some of these very early writers have an influence on other people. Before we were talking about Americans and other writers also copying other people from Europe, but now it's nice to see that some of these original writers are creating models for future writers to look at, and not necessarily to copy, but to look at as a model for what they're going to write about, an inspiration, let's say. Thomas Bangs Thorpe, another antebellum writer from the South. Here's a picture of him. I think that's definitely a photograph there. The early photographs of the daguerreotypes had to sit there for a really long time for the picture to come out, but nice and clear there. So he's most known for a short story, The Big Bear of Arkansas, in 1841. It's about the character of Jim Doggett, who hyperbolically explains the superiority of Arkansas through his series of tall tales and anecdotes. Well, we've got the biggest this, we've got the greatest that. And here, he's talking about Arkansas as representative of the South and, the Southern character here. Very interesting short story indeed. He also wrote The Master's House, and in 1854. This was an anti-slavery novel. It's not as cutting as the criticism of. It's not as cutting in its criticism of slavery, and it may even come across as ambivalent to some readers. But it does poise itself as a milder version of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, that was published right before that. We'll take a look at her a little bit later on, but I included that in this section because this is a continuation of his earlier career. But it's important to see, the development of the emergence here of the anti-slavery novels, and how the development of, the vision of African Americans in the United States are shown through literature.